You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Ben Powell of the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University. Ben, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
All right. Thank you, Garrett. Good to be here.
So our topic for today is a book you've written, co-authored with Robert Lawson. The book is entitled Socialism Sucks, Two Economists Drink Their Way Through the Unfree World. Do you want to explain that subtitle?
Well, sure. So this book started a few years ago, and Bob, my co-author, was after me to go to Cuba to check it out firsthand. And I said, my wife's not going to be thrilled that I'm just going on a drinking vacation with you to Cuba. I'm like, we need a research idea for this. And I've got this idea for a book using travel economics, and why don't we do Cuba as a test chapter? And we did, and the subtitle wasn't originally on that. It was Two Economists Travel the Unfree World. And as it evolved, though, the way Bob and I travel is we do tend to drink a bit, and the book's written as our first-hand travel story and doesn't edit any of that out. And the publisher started sending us cover images based on the text we had given them. And they all had beer mugs on them in various forms. And actually, some of them looked quite good. I had to write them back and say, you're missing the sucks part of this title, as most of those beer mugs look frothy and full to me. Now it's a couple of shattering glasses. But I'm like, also, it's not clear why there's beer on the cover to someone buying this book. And that's when we changed the subtitle to reflect it. But also, along with that, it's not just purely our drinking exploits that put us into context and place where we can talk about the history and economics of this. But the beer and alcohol in these countries actually does serve as a bit of a metaphor for how well an economic system functions, as we describe it as we go through.
Is it because when people's economic prospects are not so good, they turn to alcohol as a way of not thinking about them?
Well, not really. In this case, at least the way the metaphor works, it's more on the supply side rather than the consumption side of what an economy is able to deliver. So here, I'll give you we can dig into the different chapters and talk about the economics and the history of these places as we go through the podcast. But here's the beer metaphor that runs through the book. So Sweden is not socialist, but it is a high tax, high welfare state. So we're drinking Belgian beers in Sweden that's not very far away from Belgium, except the beers cost a whole lot more than they do in the United States, or for that matter, when we drank Belgian beers all the way around the world in Korea one time. But what it is the big welfare state with high taxes. They tax the heck out of everything, including alcohol. But it is a highly capitalist country that gives you great variety and quality of products still. Contrast that, the polar opposite of this is Venezuela. Venezuela ran out of beer. Let that sink in for a second. They ran out of beer. Their major beer producer, Polar, which is still privately owned, but government planning of the economy there dictates access to foreign exchange. And they ran out of foreign exchange to import barley with. As a result, the country essentially ran out of beer. Cuba, which is a better functioning socialist system than Venezuela, does have beer, but across the entire country, you have two types of beer, Bacanero and Cristal. Both taste like kind of crappy Budweisers. One's like 4.5% alcohol, and one might be 5% alcohol. But they're essentially the same thing. There's no variety of products to choose from. North Korea, it's just god-awful swill. It's hard to even get a can of it down. But contrast this then to a place that's reforming, like the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. And the Soviet central planners were commies. They weren't idiots. They understood that wine production had better chances in Georgia than, say, Siberia. But they mass-produced swill wine on not very high-quality land. As it's reformed and become more capitalist, those fields have gone fallow, and now hillier regions that produce better quality wine using traditional Georgian winemaking are flourishing. It's a wonderful place to visit and sample all of these different wines. It's much different than the wines that you find here in the United States. But then we end the book back in the United States, where we attended the largest socialist gathering in the country, the Socialism 2018 conference. And lo and behold, in the hotel bar, what do they have on tap for all of these socialists there but Revolution Brewery beer? And it's a brewery that most of their images have red stars and raised fists and other sort of commie logos on them. But here in a privately owned brewery that celebrates socialism, what you get is a wider variety and higher quality beer than all of the socialist countries in the world combined. They have something approaching 20 different regular beers that range in alcohol from 2% Rattler type things to 16% barley wines. So one privately owned company that likes socialism because it's privately owned and in a capitalist system is producing a greater quality and variety than all these socialist countries combined. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, the beer metaphor that runs through the book.
Yeah, it's a really interesting sort of way to approach this. I think there have been a lot of books written with, more tables of statistics and people looking at the national statistics of, Georgia and North Korea and Cuba without actually going there or sort of experiencing it or giving a more hands-on sort of personalized or personal approach to understanding these economies and what people living in them are experiencing on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, so what we were going for here, and we do have plenty of history and social science and statistics and stuff in the book too, but in a very palatable format. It's basically, as the publisher described it, this book is the bastard stepchild of Milton Friedman and Anthony Bourdain. So it's Anthony Bourdain style, but with high quality economics communicated to normal people running throughout.
Right. So Anthony Bourdain traveled the world sampling their food and writing about his travels and his experiences. And so this is the social science version. Yeah. So you briefly mentioned, Sweden and, that it's, I see in your table of contents, the title is of that section is Not Socialism, Sweden. So let's talk a little bit about, Sweden's the one that people often bring up when they want to say positive things about the idea of socialism. What in particular makes it not socialist, and then maybe tie that into to the alcohol? Is the not socialist element of it? Does that contribute to the quality of the food and the drink?
Yeah, it contributes to the quality of everything. So let's just get our definition straight here, right? Capitalism is a system based off private ownership of the means of production that predominantly uses markets to coordinate activity. Socialism has various forms, but the commonality running through all of the different forms of socialism is abolishing private ownership of the means of production, which is a little bit of a mouthful, but that just means you don't have private property in the factories, the capital, the labor, the raw materials that go into making everything. So you could have private property in your consumption goods of your personal shirt, clothing, food, what have you, but the stuff that goes into production will not be privately owned. There's going to be some version of collective ownership of those means of production. In practice, for any unit the size of a country or a large area, collective ownership as practice has always meant state ownership of the means of production and control. And these are the capitalism, socialism at two poles of a spectrum. There's no country that's perfectly capitalist, nor any that's even perfectly socialist. All of them have some degrees of government interference in the capitalist economies, and all of them have some degree of private markets that happen in the socialist economies. But we need to be clear that what those two ends of the spectrum are, and then we can evaluate where countries fall in between them. And the key with Sweden here is that the means of production are privately owned. They're privately owned, and the main way people coordinate activity is through markets. So my co-author in this book, Robert Lawson, he's best known in his academic work as the co-author of what's called the Economic Freedom of the World Annual Report. It's going on 25 years of being published now. And that is a report that basically ranks how capitalist versus how socialist countries are around the world, looking at 5 big areas: how big the government is, how secure are private property rights, how sound is the money, How free are you to trade internationally? And how regulated are you? And where Sweden stacks up in that is very free, very far towards the end of the capitalist end of the spectrum. So in that index, in the year we were evaluating in the book, they ranked 27th freest in the world. Not as free as the United States, but still vastly freer than much of the world. And Sweden's not an exception when they talk about the Nordic countries. Denmark also ranks highly. Norway ranks highly in this index as well. So what you see in Sweden is you see a big size of government. They've got a big welfare state with high taxes. And they have kind of a lot of labor market regulations. But elsewhere, they have very strong protection of private property, good money, freedom to trade internationally, low levels of regulation of credit markets or businesses. As a result, they're a very market-orientated economy. Not perfectly so. They have a big welfare state, and there's consequences to that, by the way. Sweden used to be one of the richest countries in the world before it adopted a big welfare state. It was, at one point, a very laissez-faire economy from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century. Once they put in a big welfare state and labor market regulation, it didn't turn them socialist and didn't make them suck. It just made them stop growing as fast. As a result, they're still prosperous and a healthy country, but they've dropped down in the rankings of income per capita as other more capitalist countries have grown faster and become wealthier than Sweden. But predominantly, it's still a society organized with private ownership, private control, and markets as the dominant force coordinating activity. And that's why Sweden's pretty nice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you think about that spectrum from fully capitalist to fully socialist, and with that spectrum being the more government or public ownership of the means of production you have, the more socialist you are, or vice versa, the more private ownership of the means of production you have, the more capitalist you are. You can think of the government of Sweden as being sort of like a silent partner who is entitled to a large cut of the profits you make off your private property, which they then redistribute. But they're not in general so active that they tell you exactly where to locate your factory or exactly how many units to produce or anything like that. So they're a little bit on the way towards socialism, but they still fall more on the capitalist side, and certainly rank as more capitalist than many other countries that you talk about in the book, and many that are just a little bit socialist.
Yeah, and just to be clear, the same could be said of the United States as well. Private property is attenuated to varying degrees by governments in virtually every country around the world. Hong Kong and Singapore tend to rank as the most capitalist, but even there you have various interventions that don't make private property absolute. So if you think of high taxes, that's just an attenuation on the private property you have in your profits. And as a result, it's going to distort some decision making, create some inefficiencies. But that doesn't mean that we're plunging down the road to being a socialist country.
Yeah, I this is more of an aside, but I was shocked to learn just how much of the land in Hong Kong, it's such a small country, how much of that land is publicly controlled, and so when I heard they had a pretty big housing crisis and high housing costs, I looked into it, and that's land is the most socialist part of that economy, and also the part that maybe works the least well. But okay, back to the topic of the book.
Absolutely. I've traveled there, and so has Bob. It wasn't part of this book, as it's more on the capitalist end of the spectrum. But I think you're spot on with that.
Yeah. So you get into in the book, after Sweden, which is the not socialist country, the one that is maybe often called socialist but really isn't. You travel to many of the actually socialist countries, like Venezuela. That one is kind of the classic example that a few years ago, when things looked like they were going well, people held them up as a shining example of what other places should be like, and then when things started going badly, the other side started holding them up as an example of, here's why you don't do this. What insights did you get from Venezuela?
So I think there's a few important lessons from Venezuela. It's also one of the more striking firsthand things I observed in terms of the writing of this book, because you have to understand that Venezuela and the poverty that's there now caused by the socialist economic system, this isn't normal to the extent we can call it normal third world poverty of a country that was underdeveloped. Venezuela was rich. Go back to 1970, it had a higher income per capita than Spain did. They had a very they had a free economy. Those economic freedom of the world rankings go way back to 1970, and they're still in the top 10 in the world in terms of economic freedom. But they started to have a very interventionist economy that basically stagnated it. You had virtually no growth from the late 1960s, early 1970s up until Chavez comes to power in the elections in 1998. But it was still, while it was no growth, it was still a relatively well-off place. And what you're seeing in Venezuela today is not just impoverished people in the countryside, but upper middle class people from the cities who are struggling severely to make ends meet. Millions of them have left the country. But what we are observing at the bridge crossing from Venezuela into Colombia, at the time we left, this is the bridge that's been on TV recently where they shut them down and wouldn't let aid trucks come through. People crossing the border at that time when they were free to there, bringing large luggage with them to go shopping in Cucuta, Colombia on the border to buy basic necessities, toiletries, medicines, food staples, virtually anything, because they simply not available in Venezuela. And the people you were seeing weren't the super impoverished ones. These were the people who had some access to money just that they could bring and trade. And the money, of course, is hugely devalued because of the hyperinflation there. They were bringing suitcases full of it to buy basic necessities in Colombia and go back. And the luggage that they were carrying in it is the type of luggage you'd expect to see in any major U.S. airport. Is different than seeing impoverished third world people. This is seeing an economic system that was providing for many completely collapsing. So that's kind of some of the firsthand part of it. But I think to understand the social science of this, we need to look at one of the big lessons on this is going to be about democratic socialism, because unlike Cuba, North Korea, or historically when we go into Russia, Ukraine, China, this was democratic socialism. So Chavez had tried a coup in the early 90s that failed, went to jail. In 1998, he won the elections in what were universally judged to be fair elections. Former U.S. President Jimmy Carter was one of the international observers. And then he started to implement what he called Bolivarian socialism. And he was reelected with a new constitution approved, again, all democratically. So this, in the mid-2000s, is what people in the United States were pointing to and saying, see, socialism can be successful and democratic. And on paper, it did look like Venezuela was doing relatively well in terms of income growth, reductions of poverty, educational attainments and such. But it sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves. Oil prices were high, and production was still up. As a result, what was happening was the Venezuelan government was using its foreign exchange earnings from oil in order to import things to make people in the country better off. But meanwhile, the socialist controls in Venezuela were ruining domestic production. Over this time, you see food imports soaring because food production domestically is collapsing, but they had the oil revenue to bring it in. Over time, not only did oil prices go down, but oil production went down because, remember, state ownership or control of the means of production. Venezuela owns the national oil company and didn't keep up with basic repairs, and production went down. And so with quantity down and prices down, you see the utter collapse, and then that they had no economy to fall back on that could provide for the people. So what one of my colleagues, Kevin Greer, and some co-authors did, they looked at statistically Venezuela and wanted to say, well, during those boom years, how well was Venezuelan socialism actually doing versus how much was it just what you could expect based on oil prices? And they do a cool statistical technique. I won't do too much detail here on it, but basically what you'd really like is to have one real Venezuela that got socialism and then have a fake Venezuela that's otherwise identical but didn't get Chavez and socialism. That, of course, doesn't exist, but they can statistically create that by looking at Latin American and oil-producing countries and putting them into an algorithm that says how closely does a weighted average of these track Venezuela prior to 1998 over the previous 15, 20 years. And they create synthetic Venezuela or fake Venezuela that tracks it almost perfectly. And then you let the algorithm go in 1998 and say, what should have Venezuela done if it hadn't got Chavez? And you look at this synthetic fake Venezuela, and you can compare that to what real Venezuela did. And what you find out is incomes were okay and going up in real Venezuela, but they were predicted to be going up by even more based on the performance of the peer group. Other things like reductions in poverty or improvements in health, they made improvements in Venezuela, but no better than what should have been expected based off of the peer group again. The only place where they actually performed better was in getting equality to be greater, but they did it without improving poverty relative to the peer group. So what it means is they just chopped off the top harder than other places. It's not by lifting up the bottom. So it basically, high oil prices were masking what was the chaos going on in Venezuela. And once those oil prices fell, we started seeing the crisis that we observe today. Now, I teach at Texas Tech University. That's about an hour and a half in the Permian Basin. When oil prices fell in 2013-14, there was no collapse of the Permian Basin because it was a healthy capitalist economy that makes adjustments as prices in oil go down. Venezuela was incapable of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even, not so capitalist economies like Saudi Arabia did not fall into the same level of chaos as Venezuela. I think the part where the oil price, the ability to rest on oil made it so that they, rather than, taking a few steps in that direction, noticing it wasn't working so well and maybe dialing it back, like even Lenin sort of, even after, 100 years prior, during the Russian Revolution, Lenin sort of made these socialist reforms, dialed them back a little. But if things seem to be going well, you just keep going, and that's sort of, I think a big part of the story.
And you're right. Probably the two closest economies to actually realize the full end of the socialist spectrum would have been Soviet Union under Lenin during the period of war communism, and China under Mao during the period of the Great Leap Forward. And in both of those, the devastation was immense, and they backtracked on the reforms. Venezuela never got that far down the road to pure socialism, but still they're very far down that road now. And we can see the chaos that it's causing. And it's not very long ago that everybody was singing its praises. When Chavez died in 2013, Salon read an article. In fact, the guy who wrote it is now one of Bernie Sanders' advisors. The article was called Hugo Chavez's Economic Miracle, where he said, any legacy-obsessed American president would love to have his economic record. Other people were calling it successful democratic socialism. But now what we've seen, of course, is it's merely socialism and chaotic socialism and starving socialism, but it is no longer, in a meaningful sense, democratic. Everybody knows that the elections that they had last summer were a sham. People at the state-owned companies were told if they did not vote for the regime, they would lose their job. Food aid was handed out by the government in exchange for votes at the polling places. Listen, you don't get a country where the average person lost 24 pounds in the year prior because of lack of food and then get an overwhelming support for the regime in terms of the vote. Mm-hmm. It's clear that this is no longer democratic. And of course, now what we've seen this year with Guaido declaring himself interim president as the leader of the Congress, which is allowed under their constitution, and Chavez denying it, we see full-out authoritarian dictatorship rather than democracy here. And this, I think, is a necessary outcome. Hayek, long ago in The Road to Serfdom, pointed out that you could not have a high degree of political freedom without a large degree of economic freedom, too. Milton Friedman also made this point. And the reason is, once you lose your economic freedoms, how do you exercise your democratic freedoms? The regime has great power to control your livelihood and can ask for your obedience and support in return and punish you if it does not get it. And that's what we see in Venezuela. And of course, also the economics underlying socialism dictate that your plans, as you try to coordinate the economy because of both incentive and information problems, are going to be spoiled. And as a result, you're going to confront a choice where you have to back down and give people greater economic freedoms, or crack down and take away more of their personal liberties and freedom to try to compel people to follow your plan. And this is what we've seen happening in Venezuela.
Mm-hmm. I think you misspoke a little earlier. You said Chavez when you meant Maduro, just for the audience there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Chavez
Maduro
is dead. but yeah, I mean they're
2000.
Yeah, they're peas in a pod, right? There's not really. I think people could say everything was great under Chavez because he was such a great manager, but Maduro screwed it up. But it's just a coincidence that Chavez died right before the oil price crashed globally.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's the crackdown. Like I've heard about Venezuela even jailing oil executives because they're capitalist saboteurs and just the kinds of things where they doubled down on the things that weren't working rather than dialing back, and that seems to have been what got them where they are now. But let's talk about let's move north a little. Cuba has been a stable example of socialism for half a century now, more actually, and they seem to be doing okay. Some people have praised their their medical system. I don't know what the state of the debate on Cuba is. They're certainly a poor country, but what is Cuba doing that makes them less of a disaster than Venezuela?
All right, so let's bring this to some just more anecdotal stuff maybe for Cuba. We'll make it more travel-y now and less statistic-y. And I think what you can do in Cuba that's harder to do in Venezuela and essentially impossible to do in North Korea is you can bang around and really see the functioning of a planned economy. And Cuba is really poor. It's in any socialist country, GDP per capita statistics are just are bullshit because you don't have market prices. Mm-hmm. Without market prices, calculating GDP is, I don't know, not meaningless, but damn near meaningless. But that said, estimates put them somewhere $2,000-$3,000 per person income. So they're a very poor country. But the kind of the economist game of walking around Cuba is when you see weird outcomes, what of it is because of poverty and what of it is it because of government ownership and planning, and separating these two things out. And there's just a lot of oddities you see in subsistence socialism in Cuba. And even and Cuba does allow for markets in some things, many things. And even there, you can see the interaction between the planning and the market. So to give one example or a couple examples of things here. So government ownership of means of production. The government owns all of the hotels. So the hotels are owned by the state. Nobody earns a profit by having you like their hotels. Now, you have exceptions like the Hotel Nacional, which is a 5-star legit fancy hotel that the diplomats stay in. But the Soviets could put a cosmonaut in space. The Cubans can have one good hotel. Staying there isn't particularly informative. But staying in normal 3-star, say, Cuban hotels, what you find is they suck. They're deteriorated. Their pool is dirty. Their elevators don't work. The toilet seat's not bolted down. You have the last guest soap in your dish. You have broken windows. You have ceiling panel tiles missing in your bathroom. And it's just because no one cares. No one has an incentive to try to do better because nobody profits by doing it. But this contrast, they allow what they call casa particular. So they let people rent out rooms in their private houses. Now, they don't have full property rights to be able to sell their property, but they have control rights over their property and the right to rent a room or even a whole apartment to people. It's the same service that the hotels are providing, right? A room to sleep in. Except what you see for rates that are cheaper, places that are in immaculate condition, whose air conditioning works, that's clean, that people meet you on time to let you in, other than unlike the government hotels that didn't even have a reservation. And it's because they can take the meager profits from doing this, they reinvest it to make it nicer so that more people will buy from it. This is the power of economic incentives, even this limited property rights sense that they have with the renting of rooms. You can also see it in restaurants. The state-run restaurants, remember, government ownership of the means of production. Government owned most of the restaurants. They started liberalizing and allowing for private restaurants, first with very limited seating, and they couldn't serve meat or seafood. Now they can serve meat and seafood, and the seating has got bigger, although it's still limited, although it looks like people violate it regularly as far as I can tell. And you can see somewhere they've invested capital and have, stainless steel kitchens that you'd expect to find in a U.S. restaurant. At first, they seem okay. Even the government restaurants are god awful. I walked out on a couple of them. The food was so disgusting. Mm-hmm. But the private ones are decent quality food. But you start noticing after 7-10 days or so, like all of the menus are basically the same. They're private-owned restaurants, but they deal with the government state supply chain to get their ingredients. As a result, the food is very bland. Cuban food in Miami is much better than Cuban food in Cuba. And this, by the way, of course, is from the perspective of a relatively wealthy visitor. Most of the Cubans living there can't afford to eat in the restaurants that I was going in. You usually see trade-offs all around the world of price, quality of food, and quality of venue, where you can get two of these three things right, but not all three. As in, you can be at a high-quality venue with high-quality food, but you pay a high cost, or you can get any two of those right at once. In Cuba, it was basically all the private restaurants, all the same quality food, all the same menu items. So, and they would basically all have the same prices. So you could just pick a place based on venue, pick the place with a view, because the usual trade-offs aren't there. Other oddities: try to find a shopping district or even a bar if you're just walking aimlessly through central Havana. And it's not at all obvious where they are. Now, this isn't a symptom of being poor. Go to any poor country in the world and you'll see beer signs all over the place where you can buy beer, because the beer company will give the signs to the little restaurants and stands for free. Cuba lacks signs. Why do they lack signs? Well, because no one cares whether you shop in their restaurant or not, or their store or not. If they're government-owned stores, no one has an incentive to try to bring you there. For Americans, they're familiar with the Cuban cars of having American 1950s cars. It seems kind of quaint until you try to go 6 hours down the road in one of them, and you're hot, sweaty, windburned, and your suspension isn't keeping up with the Cuban roads. But want to guess, actually, Garrett, let's play a game called The Price is Wrong. You want to guess what a 1950s U.S. car sells for in Cuba? Keeping in mind, it's a very poor country. And these are cars that, aren't like nicely restored. They're held together with popsicle sticks and bubble gum. Any idea what one of these goes for?
Oof. I'm going to say I have no idea. So 1950s, thinking about the price of my used car in Canada, which is much newer. So let's say, and then adjusting, $500?
Try closer to $15,000.
Whoa. Okay. Well, yeah, because they don't have any newer stock to compete with them.
Well, there is some newer stock. It's very limited. So here's the whole key is, right, that Cuba drastically restricts car imports. So yes, the United States does have an embargo on Cuba, but you can get cars from all around the world. We don't have a blockade on Cuba. We're not stopping Kias from getting into Cuba. Cuba stops Kias from getting into Cuba. So there are some newer cars. There's also old crappy Russian-made Ladas and things like that. But take a 1990s Peugeot or something that basically doesn't exist in Canada or the United States. You don't even give it to your high school kid anymore. Now that'll go for closer to $30,000 in Cuba, because it might have air conditioning that works and has disc brakes and a better suspension. So what you see in Cuba is that it's not integrated into the world economy's price system. So relative prices are all messed up. Price theory works. If you understand supply and demand, you can figure out a lot of things that are going on there. But the relative price structure and how the rest of the world is, It's just not there in Cuba the same way. The one thing that it is there on is cigars, because the Cuban government, again, remember government ownership of the means of production, essentially is the monopoly cigar exporter for Cuba. So as a result, they don't sell good Cuban cigars cheaply in Cuba because they use those to earn their foreign exchange. So that world market prices is a pretty good predictor of. But lots of other things, relative price structures just all messed up, which means that things are scarce that shouldn't be. This is all just economic discoordination that you see widespread throughout the country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I frequently use the cars as an analogy when I'm explaining zoning and land use restrictions in the context of housing. I think I need to start using Cuba as my example. It's, here's this durable good, and here's what happens when you don't create new stock. The price for older, crumbling versions units stays high. I think I've...
Yeah, and as a result, too, by the way, labor is very cheap in Cuba, but to hire a driver to take you somewhere is very expensive because the capital's scarce. And by the way, this points to another thing, too, that you had mentioned about Cuban healthcare at the beginning.
Right.
And yes, the government does do a lot of investing in healthcare, but there's 3 tiers of the system. There's the system for the paying foreigners, there's the system for the ruling elite, and then there's the system for the regular people. And the regular people often have to bring their own sheets to the hospital with them. So when you see these longevity statistics of, Cubans on average live as long or longer than Americans, one of the longest life expectancies in the Americas, you got to start asking, is it the healthcare that's doing it, or is it something else? And just to stay with the example that we're on, if cars are really scarce, you don't have many car accidents. If you don't have car accidents, people aren't dying in car accidents. But at least as a percentage basis, as a cause of death, car accidents are a relatively high cause of death among younger people. And younger people, when they die, disproportionately pull down your life expectancy statistics. So it's not a sign necessarily that Cuba is doing so well in longevity. It's that they don't have one of the things that people like to have, but that lowers life expectancy. Along with that, you see in Cuba in the abortions, the pre-birth and post-birth deaths around the world is a fairly stable ratio of that. Places are better off or worse off on the number, but the ratio between the two is relatively stable. As in when you get richer, both of them go down proportionately. So Cuba, it's a way outlier. Much higher death rate before birth than after. And what's probably going on there is forced abortions of high-risk pregnancies. And if you have more, and they have a very high rate of abortion, if you have abortions prior to birth, then that does not affect your life expectancy. If a baby dies, that does affect your life expectancy, and it affects it a lot because it's a less than 1-year-old die. So a lot of these things that you see of good, not all, but a lot of these things that you see about good Cuban healthcare are really a byproduct of a dysfunctional system.
Right. That's an example of Goodhart's law. That they had this target of reducing infant mortality, and one way you can do that is to abort all risky pregnancies in order to not count them in the infant mortality statistics, which is kind of I think no one who was really thinking about it would say, okay, this mother wants to have a child. It's a risky pregnancy. We can try to save the baby's life, and maybe they've got a 50-50 shot. No one would say, oh, it's a terrible thing to do that, because half the time the baby will live, and, but it affects your national statistics in a way that the central government does not want. And so they don't do that. And which is a very, very sort of odd perversion of incentives. So let's move on from Cuba and talk about North Korea. So I have been to North Korea. I went to the DMZ and got and stood on the North Korean side of the table there. So I've been all of 2 meters inside the country. Did you actually tour North Korea? Did you actually enter it?
Yeah. So we cheated a little bit with North Korea. Mm-hmm. So my wife and Bob's wife both said that we couldn't get killed or imprisoned in the course of writing this book.
Fair.
Jailed is fine because that's temporary. uh, but when it came to North Korea, we discussed whether we should go in for real or not. And frankly, actually, I'm a bit pessimistic that we would have been able to get visas from the Korean government anyway. I mean, I direct something called the Free Market Institute. Bob is the co-author of the Economic Freedom of the World Annual Report. You can find video of him online saying, well, Venezuela ranks last, but it's not really last. We know Korea's last. North Korea's last. We just can't measure it. In fact, anything that's good, you can guarantee North Korea is going to be the bottom of that list. So I don't think they would have been particularly amenable to giving us visas anyway. So the way we did it is we went to South Korea first and explored in South Korea. And then, like you, we toured the DMZ part. But then to get a better look at Korea and the side-to-side contrast, we went up to Dandong, China, on the northern border of North Korea. And Dandong's a large Chinese city there, right across the river from the main export city in North Korea, where most of their trade's with China. And did some work cruising up and down the river there and meeting and talking to local people there and some who would get out of North Korea to give it kind of the firsthand perspective. And, a lot of people, I'm sure, Garrett, that you're one of them, have seen the satellite image of North Korea at night, contrasting that with South Korea and China. And what you see is just the North Korean capital has a little speck of light, and otherwise the country's dark at night. And it was striking flying into Dandong. I got to my hotel, I don't know, probably 9, 10 in the evening, something like that. And go up to my window and look out, and it's basically black across the river. You can't see anything there. The next day you wake up, open your curtains, and whoa, there's a city of 300,000 people sitting across the river that was virtually invisible at night. And this here is the major export area from North Korea to China. And in the history of this in North Korea and South Korea's case, we don't need to create the synthetic Venezuela, a synthetic Korea the way we did for Venezuela. This is actually a rare case where you have side by side, same history, same culture, same geography, same level of economic development, where at the end of the Korean War, you have one who adopts a socialist economic system and one that adopts a capitalist economic system. And in fact, the end of World War II, before the Korean War, if there was one that was better off, it was probably the area in the north. The north of Korea had about 80% of the industry, 90% of the electricity, 3/4 of the mining was there. Now, the whole peninsula gets decimated during the war. If the South is better at anything, maybe it's a slightly better climate, favorable to agriculture, a little bit better. But after the Korean War, with aid from the United States in the South, the Soviets in the North, I've said that GDP per capita in socialist countries is kind of BS. But to the extent we can measure these things, circa 1960, incomes per capita are about equal in the North and the South. The one major difference between the two is the economic system. Private businesses were outlawed in North Korea. Agriculture was collectivized in North Korea. It's probably the most centrally planned, the most socialist country in the world today. Meanwhile, South Korea went a different path. It took them a while to get political liberalization and a little bit while to get their economic liberalization in place. But they're in the top 20% of the Economic Freedom Index. Average incomes are close to $40,000. You see life expectancy rocket from, around 50 years to up over 80 years today. Infant mortality rates drop 96%. Just dramatic growth story, one of the Asian tigers. Meanwhile, to the extent we can estimate incomes in North Korea today, they're probably only around $1,700 or so. 3 million people starved to death in the 1990s as far as we can measure it. I don't think you could have a more black and white contrast between capitalism and socialism as you do on the Korean peninsula. It's just you can't see much of it from the South Korean side because of the DMZ, but you get up on the Yalu River on the north and look from one side of the river to the other, and you see dilapidated, low-slung buildings with subsistence agriculture on one side, and you see skyscrapers and trucks screaming down the highway on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
That's not natural. That's institutions and policy barriers that change the economic rules of the game and incentives, and thus the outcomes.
And speaking on of the other side of that river, China itself is nominally socialist. Do you have thoughts on why it's doing so well compared to North Korea?
Yeah, because we call the Chinese chapter fake socialism, because it's the Chinese Communist Party that's still in charge, and they have a political monopoly. But their economic system has evolved so much that on that spectrum of capitalism, socialism, it would be incorrect to label it socialism. It's moved dramatically in the capitalist direction. Now, it's still crony capitalist. There's lots of problems with it, lots of interventions. It's still state-owned enterprises and stuff. This is by no means sliding down the scale to fully capitalist. But from where it was starting from, it's made great progress. Because what we saw, right, is that Chinese communism under Mao was one of the closest during the Great Leap Forward, where agriculture was collectivized. People had to eat in the communes. You had state production targets for steel and heavy industry. People were melting down things in their backyard furnace. This was a totalitarian planned economy in the period 1957 to 62-ish. It's the one that probably took the greatest toll in terms of human lives. Frank Dickotter's book on this, Mao's Great Famine, is probably the most accurate accounting of it that's out there right now, although it's still speculative, but puts the death toll at somewhere around 45 million people dying unnecessarily during that time. And to call it a famine is to mask the intentionality of it, of government leaders sticking with their plans despite knowing the casualties that it's causing. And eventually you get a retrenchment from that a little bit, but then you get the Cultural Revolution that follows it up, where you have another, 500,000 to 2 million people or so who die. This was a socialist economy. Reform starts around 1978 with Deng Xiaoping coming to power. Deng Xiaoping had been one of Mao's associates, but he got purged during the 1960s. He comes to power as a leader in 78 and starts allowing the decollectivization of agriculture, town and village enterprises. These are all things where just limited degrees of private property and markets are being introduced. And a lot of it wasn't coming from above, but was happening below. And by below, I mean at the local level. And then later, the Central Communist Party would kind of bless it, ironically, and say that, oh, yes, this is consistent with our policy. And then it would spread. In fact, Deng Xiaoping said something along the lines of, it doesn't matter what color the cat is as long as the cat catches mice, meaning these policies, as long as they're creating growth, it's going to be good. And start calling it, this is Chinese socialism with China, like socialism with Chinese characteristics, which really just meant more and more capitalism. Mm-hmm. In terms of its economic freedom score, it was first ranked in 1980. It was down near the bottom, 3.5 out of 10. But it improved 75% by 1990, up significantly. These things, those statistics don't even accurately represent the true level of freedom, because starting in those are national policies. Starting in the 1980s, you get enterprise zones that have much greater economic freedoms, better private property rights, and they expand around and get more and more of them around the country. And that's where you see a lot of the great growth occurring in the enterprise zones. In fact, one of the more striking ones to see firsthand is in Shanghai, the Pudong district across the river from it. The old 19th century trading city Shanghai is still there, but across the river, as recently as 1990, was its slums. Now, if you Google Shanghai skyline, it's not going to show you a picture of traditional Shanghai. It's going to show you a view of the Pudong district that was a slum, where you have the tower that goes up with the balls on it, the new skyscrapers. This was an area that became a free trade zone and actually has greater free finance, which banking is heavily regulated in China, so extra financial freedoms here matter a lot. And you have something that in a period of 20 years goes from being a slum to having incomes per capita in the mid-20,000s. And meanwhile, what you also see in China, remember, we have a massive population in a large country. You've got big differences in economic freedom, particularly in the enterprise zones, but even in just coastal territories versus inland territories. And we've been seeing a great mass migration of hundreds of millions of people moving from less free interior zones to more free cities. And the income gains that you can get from going from rural China to cities in China they're as big as the income gains people in Latin America want to migrate to the United States to achieve, except there's little to stop them from doing that in China. So you see just a lot of migration-driven growth that's fueling a lot of this. Now, meanwhile, the government is still a totalitarian police state. It's just granted a lot of economic freedoms. Witnessed this firsthand. We spoke at a conference there when we were doing this book, and we thought it was pretty cool. We were right down in central Beijing and talking about Ayn Rand and Ludwig von Mises with Chinese professors and graduate students. And then we went on our way the next day. The conference was continuing, or was supposed to continue, until the government chained the building closed, put under house arrest the founder of the institute that was hosting it, because they didn't want those ideas being talked about. So there's a tension here in China as they're granting greater economic freedoms, how long they'll be able to still exert political repression. And I'm not really sure how that plays out. And of course, we're seeing that the tension with Hong Kong right now.
Wow, that's quite dramatic. The story about them shutting down your conference. You kind of, it's easy to forget, just with how capitalist and sort of how much free enterprise there is in China. That the ideas underlying it are still officially not sanctioned and even cracked down on by the state.
Yeah, and the crackdown has continued on that group. It's called the Unirule Institute. It's a market-orientated private think tank in China. And what they've since had happen is twice they've been kicked out of their offices by the communist government. And multiple people in the institute have now lost permission to travel abroad. The current regime is cracking down on free speech and intellectual freedom, even while the economic freedoms remain.
Yeah, and here where I live on the West Coast in Vancouver, there are a lot of Chinese immigrants, and many wealthy Chinese people come here, not because they particularly don't like living in China, but just because they fear that if the political winds could shift towards more oppression, and in particular more oppression of people with wealth, more they could see everything they've achieved expropriated overnight if things do not liberalize, if they go the other way politically. So it's kind of it's in a scary place. There's a lot to be hopeful about, but still a lot to be concerned about too.
There's a lot to be concerned about going forward, but we should still appreciate how far they have come with granting greater economic freedoms, and that it's literally meant hundreds of millions of people escaping extreme poverty. Probably no time in human history have sheer numbers of people escaped extreme poverty as rapidly as what we're seeing and have seen in China.
So we're approaching the end of our time. Do you have any closing thoughts, any sort of big takeaways that someone who's listened to this conversation should come away with?
Yeah, so we end by going to the Socialist Conference in the United States and talking to, because we're trying to understand, given what we've seen in these socialist countries, knowing the history of them, the economics of them, how is it that we see that democratic socialism is popular, particularly among young people, but just generally more popular in the United States today than it has been in the recent past? I think that a lot of people who identify with the label socialism are just some version of left-wing politics, but don't actually mean or even understand necessarily nationalizing or abolishing private property and the means of production in a significant sense. And it's just some version of hard left politics. But then there's another group that does mean abolishing private property and replacing it with collective ownership. None of them that I spoke to are willing to own North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, or for that matter, the Soviet Union and China in the past as examples of what they mean. Instead, they say, no, I want socialism from below. And as far as I can tell, what this means is they don't want an authoritarian state. They want kind of the workers to decide for themselves what to produce and to share in the proceeds equally, or some version of this. But what they miss is that there's a reason why when you replace private property in markets, you always get central plans and then they become authoritarian. It's because you still have to coordinate economic activity. If this isn't your hippie commune, but your whole society, you have literally almost an incalculable number of goods and services that can be produced in numerous ways. You need some way to reconcile this. If the workers in a tire plant want to make 35-inch tires and workers in the truck plant are making places with trucks with 20-inch wheels, you need some way to reconcile this. And in markets, prices coordinate behavior. If we're going to get rid of markets and the price system, you need some other coordinating mechanism. That has been the central plan. And the central plan cannot coordinate as well as markets, but it does coordinate better than no plan and no markets. And I think that the link between abolishing private property implying a necessity of a central plan, and once you have that, the recipe that it sets up for totalitarian regimes, I think that's lost on a lot of the people who advocate for socialism today. So I'd like them to consider that more and, enjoy reading some of the lessons in this book and know that actually Bob and I, when we were at their conferences, a lot of the issues that they talked about, we sympathize with. It's just we don't think socialism is the answer to the issue that they see as a problem. Instead, it's markets and freedom are better answers to these things.
Mm-hmm. Well, my guest today has been Ben Powell. The book is Socialism Sucks: Two Economists Drink Their Way Through the Unfree World, which I'll link to at economicsdetective.com. Ben, thanks for being part of Economics Detective Radio.
Thanks for having me, Garrett.
Hey listeners, hope you enjoyed that episode. You may have noticed that I've been releasing on a more regular schedule lately, and I've been able to do that thanks to my Patreon supporters. It's thanks to them that I can hire someone else to do the editing for me, and that really frees up a lot of my time to make more episodes. I've also optimized my scheduling system. I don't need to go into that in great detail, but, making marginal improvements every day here at the podcast. If you want to help support the show, there are two main ways to do it. One is to just join our Facebook group and join the conversation there. The other is to support through Patreon, which you can find a link to at economicsdetective.com. Thanks, and I'll be back next week with a new episode.